Let's go ahead and kick things off officially. I want to welcome everyone who's in the call for joining us today to focus on the topic of Christian persecution in Egypt. My name is Stephen Howard, and I'm IDC's National Outreach Director. And we have an exciting panel of experts, as well as two members of Congress who are joining us. And it's going to be a really thrilling conversation. To kick things off, we'll have our members of Congress deliver special remarks. Then our panel will be delivering more in-depth comments and thoughts on the situation in Egypt. We'll then switch to an opportunity for those on the call to participate in a Q&A, and then we'll have our panelists close us off with some concluding thoughts. Now, we are very excited. Again, as I mentioned, we have a bipartisan set of members of Congress delivering remarks. We have Congressman French Hill of Arkansas and Congressman Brad Sherman of California. First, we'll have Mr. Sherman of California speak, and I'll invite Tawfiq Baklini, president of IDC, to introduce him.
Yes, I want to introduce a very good friend of ours that has been working in defense of Christians and on behalf of the persecuted in the Middle East and all over the world. And Congressman Sherman has been a champion, a congressional champion of IDC, and looking forward to hear from you as well as from the Congressman French Hill. Congressman, there's a lot to do to help our Egyptian brothers and sisters, and there are many ways to help, especially in Congress. Egypt depends on our U.S. aid. There's a lot of pressure that we can work on from the congressional side, and we will be able to put more pressure on the Egyptian government and President Sisi to make sure our Coptic brothers and sisters are treated equally in Egypt. So thank you for being with us today, and please, we're waiting to hear from you, Congressman.
Hello, I'm Congressman Brad Sherman from California's best named city, Sherman Oaks. Thank you for inviting me to this Zoom presentation, and thank you for all the efforts of IDC. I've worked with you for, it seems like, almost a decade on all of these issues, from Iraq to Egypt to throughout the Middle East, and the importance of defending what were among the first Christian communities in the world is so important. For 24 years, I've served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and for 24 years, I've advocated for the rights of religious minorities around the world, particularly the Coptic community of Egypt. In 2019, I was honored to be named Congressional Champion by your organization, and also to receive a leadership award from Coptic Solidarity. I have met with President Sisi, and when I have, and whenever I meet with the ambassador or the foreign minister, stress the importance of the community of Coptic Christians in Egypt, a community that is close to 20 million strong. I've, of course, met with the foreign minister on many occasions, and Congress is paying attention to the Coptic community and how Egypt treats this Christian minority. And as you point out, Egypt receives an enormous amount of American aid. Unfortunately, the arbitrary detention of Coptic and human rights activists continues. In October, I joined with many of our colleagues in sending letters to President Sisi urging immediate release of human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, political activists, and other prisoners of conscience in Egypt. These individuals should never have been imprisoned in the first place. In September, the Middle East and North Africa subcommittee, on which I sit, held long overdue hearings on human rights in Egypt. During those hearings, I, of course, raised the case of Coptic activist Rami Kamel, an advocate for the full civil rights of Egypt's Coptic Christian community. We must not allow the Egyptian government to punish and silence Coptic advocates without being held to account. Of course, my work with you goes back a long way. I think it was in the 114th Congress. I was the chief Democrat on the resolution about the Coptic churches, the Coptic Church Accountability Act. Last Congress, I joined in supporting in co-sponsoring another resolution, the Supporting Coptic Christians in Egypt resolution, HR 49. This resolution acknowledges the importance of the U.S.-Egypt partnership, of course, and Egypt's role in fighting terrorism, but it also urges the Egyptian government to enact serious, legitimate reforms to ensure that Coptic Christians have the same rights and opportunities as other Egyptian citizens, and to take steps to end the culture of impunity that unfortunately exists in much of Egypt for attacks on Christians. I look forward to supporting this resolution again when it is reintroduced. I hope that you'll contact my office whenever we can be of assistance, whenever we can show a spotlight, whenever we can get the message to the Egyptian government that yes, Camp David was good, but that was a long time ago. And we'd like to see Egypt step forward when it comes to respecting human rights. So I look forward to working with French Hill and others. Your cause is bipartisan, and I will continue to be one of the most active Democrats in defending in defense of Christians in the Middle East. So thank you very much. I'm Brad Sherman.
Thank you, Congressman. We're incredibly honored for your friendship and partnership, and it means a lot that you're here with us today. I'll turn it back to Mr. Boccolini for any concluding thoughts for yourself, as well as the introduction of Congressman Hill.
Thank you, Congressman Sherman. You've always been a friend, and we'll count on your support. Thank you very much. And next, I would like to introduce Congressman French Hill. He's also been a congressional champion for IDC. Thank you for all of your support and all that you've been doing, and specifically what you've been doing for our Coptic brothers and sisters. So from here, please, Congressman, we're waiting to hear from you and what we can do in this next Congress.
Well, Tawfiq, thank you for that kind introduction. And Steve Howard, thanks for putting together this IDC panel and presentation and discussion. And let me say, one of the most treasured things in my office is my plaque from IDC, a cedar from Lebanon, a country that all needs our prayers right now as they suffer not only from the Syrian war, dysfunction, political dysfunction, the catastrophic explosion in Beirut, but now COVID-19 is wreaking havoc in Lebanon. So our prayers go out to all in Lebanon. I think of them daily due to your beautiful plaque in my office. And to my friend Brad Sherman, what a treat it has been for me, a junior member of Congress, having been in Congress 6 years on the House Financial Services Committee with Brad, watching him work both on that committee and on House Foreign Affairs. We're grateful for his outspoken, passionate leadership on this issue of religious persecution, religious minorities, but also on his standing up for the rights of citizens around the world that live in tough, authoritarian places that have no pluralism, whether it's Iran or China, and whether it's religious freedom or a broader agenda. And so, Brad Sherman, thanks. And thanks for partnering on this contribution to the efforts in Egypt. I do plan on reintroducing our resolution that Congressman Sherman referenced, and I hope that I have good, new, thoughtful feedback from both IDC and our Coptic community as it relates to the findings and the call for action in that resolution. We've had it now with broad bipartisan co-sponsorship since 2017. We had good support from the Trump administration, State Department, and I think they did a good job in the Trump administration on religious freedom generally. And I know Brad and I are anxious to see that kind of leadership out of the incoming Biden administration. And we'll work with the Biden administration to achieve that, and working bilaterally with Egypt on a foreign aid basis. And as Brad noted, to try to fight back against this culture of impunity. I've said consistently in my meetings with President Sisi, look, there are many things at the top that he's done that are encouraging. And the same is true for the Grand Imam at Al-Azhar. But it hasn't changed the challenges that we have on the street in Egypt. And it hasn't changed the particular challenges that we have in the most troubling province in Egypt, Minya province. The two Coptic Christians that we'll be discussing today, I think more in Congress need to know the details of, and I'm grateful for the panel bringing up Rami Kamel and Suat Tabat and the unfortunate examples of what continues to be a long story in Egypt. But I do look forward to working with my House colleagues in this incoming Congress, as I say, to end this culture of impunity and to get Egypt to do a much better job. So Brad Sherman, thanks for your partnership on this, and IDC, thank you for the work you're doing across the world, not just in Egypt, but around the world. And to our Coptic brothers and sisters, we hope that 2021 will be a year in which we have even more bipartisan support and can have a bipartisan group of members go to Cairo and again press our case that while we're grateful for Egypt's partnership since Camp David, as a key strategic partner of the American people and peace in the Middle East, they need to do more domestically on the subject of protecting the rights of Coptic Christians. So thank you, Tawfiq, and let me yield back, and I look forward to our panel discussion today.
Thanks, French.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman, and looking forward to working with both of you in 2021.
Absolutely. Well said, Tawfiq. And Congressman, if you both would like to stick around, we'd be honored to have you if you want to participate in the Q&A, but we also understand if there's other business to attend to. It's really my pleasure now to introduce an exciting panel of experts who are going to be talking about the issue of Christian persecution in Egypt. We have Commissioner Nadine Maenza from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, also known as USCIRF. Also with USCIRF, we have Dr. Kurt Werthmuller, who's a supervisory policy analyst with the Commission. We also have Samuel Tedros, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom, and really the leading DC expert on Coptic persecution. To kick things off, we're going to start with Commissioner Maenza, then we'll pivot over to Dr. Werthmuller, and then we'll conclude with Mr. Tedros. And so to start off with Commissioner Maenza, the question that I really wanted just to kind of kick things off with, in 2020, USCIRF recommended that Egypt be placed on a special watch list. Can you just introduce us to USCIRF's overall concerns about religious freedom in the country, as well as your recommendations for what the U.S. can do to engage with Egypt to really incentivize improved behavior?
Sure. As the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, has noted over the last couple of years, there has been a marked shift in the way that Egypt recognizes and discusses religious freedom challenges in the country. In years past, such as during the Mubarak presidency, Egypt generally refused to recognize any form of discrimination or challenges facing non-Muslims, blaming sectarian issues on terrorists or people with mental illness. The Sisi administration has changed the nature of this discourse, publicly acknowledging religious freedom challenges and making some incremental changes, such as the church building law of 2016, which I'll discuss shortly. 2 years ago, I was able to join some of my colleagues at the Cathedral of the Nativity in New Cairo as President Sisi opened it and continued his annual tradition of joining public Eid masses. While these actions were purely symbolic, they did represent a shift in public discourse that I know the Congressman mentioned earlier, especially important coming from the President himself. While USERF acknowledges these modest changes, Egypt still has a way to go in terms of truly establishing religious freedom in the country, not just for Coptic Christians, but for the Muslim majority and for smaller non-Muslim communities as well. So for that reason, USERF has continued to recommend Egypt for the special watch list at the State Department. So our overall concerns, which overlap, are number one, systematic and ongoing discrimination, number two, sectarian violence, and number three, the overlap of legal repression and religious freedom violations. I will devote my remarks to discussing the first two of those areas and our recommendations that pertain directly to those. And then my USERF colleague, Dr. Kurt Werthmuller, will discuss some of our recent reporting and findings on that last issue. Regarding systematic and ongoing discrimination of Coptic Christians, we find that discrimination is in some ways one of the hardest issues to pin down in a country like Egypt, in which the Constitution and various laws suggest equality among citizens regardless of religion, including Article 53 of the Constitution. And yet the practical and enforced realities fall far short. Religious freedom advocates have long pointed to the proportionally poor representation of non-Muslims in official capacities, including the security and foreign affairs sectors, as well as in positions of high-ranking public office. There have been some key appointments in recent years, including Ms. Manal Mikhail as governor of Damiat in 2018, and Ms. Phoebe Fauzi as Deputy Speaker of the Senate just last month. These are modest advancements, but still important to recognize. The implementation of the Church Building Law of 2016 provides a useful example of the ways in which discrimination appears in the Egyptian system. The law itself has been slow to implement. Since its passage in 2016, the Egyptian cabinet has approved around 1,800 of the 5,200 churches and church-related buildings that applied for registration. Yes, Egyptian bureaucracy is infamous for moving slowly, but that number represents only a third of all the applicants. While it is a positive thing that President Sisi has ordered all new neighborhoods to include places of worship for both Muslims and Christians, the slow implementation of this law means that thousands of Copts, mostly in villages scattered around Upper Egypt and the Nile Delta, still have no legal place to worship. So two other issues plague this implementation that we really need to consider. The first is church registration is still substantially different and far less proportional to mosques in the country. Even with the current approved registrations, there are still roughly 250% more mosques than churches in proportion to the respective population of Muslims to Christians, even by a conservative estimate. Second, although the law stipulates that churches awaiting registration approval should remain open, there has been several incidents in the last 2 years in which mob attacks in rural areas have forced the long-term closure of such properties with no sign of the government stepping in to enforce this requirement. For example, in early 2019, in the village of Man Shayat in Zafarana in the Minya province that I know has been problematic for a lot of these mob violence situations, Muslims were stirred to anger over a local preacher. So they surrounded a church and started chanting threats and insults. The police responded not by arresting those who threatened the church, but by closing the church, thus joining the ranks of similarly closed churches in Minya province and elsewhere that the church building law technically mandated should remain open. In other words, while the church building law represents an improvement from the past in a way for unlicensed churches to be recognized, its implementation and enforcement, as well as the disparity between how churches and mosques are handled within this framework, falls far short of equality, not to mention true religious freedom. In terms of sectarian violence, fortunately, there has been a clear decline in most severe instances of anti-Christian violence in comparison to the burning of dozens of churches by Muslim Brotherhood supporters in 2013, or the deadly attacks by ISIS remnants of Coptic pilgrims visiting the Minya area monasteries in 2018 and 2019. However, sectarian mob attacks in rural villages continue to plague Egypt's Coptic community. There were far fewer incidents in 2020, possibly because of widespread church and mosque closures for much of the year due to COVID-19 restrictions. But such attacks did occur early and late in the year. For example, In November, after rumors spread that a local Christian cattle farmer had insulted Islam in a Facebook post, Muslim villagers in Marsha near Melawi attacked Coptic homes and the local Orthodox church, setting fire to some of the properties. It's important to note that while reports explain that Muslim neighbors came to help and offered refuge to some of the Christians fleeing the violence, when the police arrived, they arrested the attackers and the victims alike. Munia's chief of security did reportedly speak to villagers afterwards and warn them of the danger of this type of violence. But to our knowledge, none of the attackers, including whoever caused serious burn injuries to an elderly woman, have been charged with a crime. Finally, while I recognize the emphasis of this event is on conditions facing Christians in Egypt, I've always appreciated In Defense of Christians' commitment to also draw attention to the circumstances of other religious and non-religious groups, because we all know that all minorities are impacted when any minority is being impacted. In Egypt, non-believers and atheists, Quranists, Baha'is, Shia Muslims, and others, especially former Muslims, often face serious societal or legal repercussions for publicly voicing their beliefs, or even sometimes privately for doing so. For example, in August, police arrested Rita Abdelrahman, a scholar at Al Azhar Institute in the town of Kafr Sakr in Sharqiya province, for his teaching of Quranism, the belief that only the Quran, not prophetic traditions and other traditional sources as Sunni jurisprudence, should guide the lives of Muslims. Now, he is likely facing charges now of insulting religion, and which we see as part of a trend that Dr. Werthmuller will be discussing shortly. Rita Abdelrahman's arrest should serve as an important reminder that as long as government authorities and prosecutors see themselves as arbiters of what people can and should believe and express, religious freedom will remain elusive in Egypt. In other words, the freedom of all religion communities in Egypt and those with no religion at all are intertwined and should be protected as such. The question remains as to how the above continues relates to USERF's recommendations to the U.S. government and how to best encourage the improvement for religious freedom conditions in Egypt. I wanted to close by highlighting these two sets of recommendations from our 2020 annual report that are, I really feel like they're very strong recommendations that would make a big difference if they were followed. The first is to urge the Egyptian government to cease the longstanding practice of seizing legal authority to customary reconciliation councils to resolve incidents of sectarian mob violence, repeal decrees banning Baha'is and Jehovah's Witnesses, remove religion from official identity documents, and pass laws consistent with Article 53 of the Constitution. The second is that the U.S. should allocate a portion of assistance to the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, to reform public school curriculum and teacher training and to promote greater religious inclusivity throughout the country. In the first of these, as you can tell, combines several of the longstanding concerns USERF has in regard to how religious discrimination affects several different communities. Customary reconciliation councils, which are often invoked in response to sectarian mob attacks in rural areas, almost universally end with absolving the perpetrators of the violence of all responsibility and consequences. Furthermore, they often require victims to share the blame and in some cases to actually suffer punishment, such as exiles from their homes and villages. USERF has long opposed this practice, and we continue to call on Egypt's judiciary to uphold the rule of law in response to these incidents. Instead of handling responsibility to the local majorities, Dr. Werthmuller will have some more to say on this subject momentarily. At the same time, as suggested above, the protection of smaller religious minorities such as Baha'is and Jehovah's Witnesses is a crucial step to protecting religious freedom. It is our longstanding request to remove religion from national ID cards altogether, an unnecessary requirement that opens the door to many forms of discrimination, and which Egypt's own Constitution of 2014 prohibits, according to Article 53. And finally, USERF has praised and continues to support the work of the Minister of Education in reforming public school curriculum to remove sectarian language and encourage interreligious respect and inclusivity. I had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Tariq Shaki, the current Minister of Education, and was impressed with his work and revised primary school textbooks we were allowed to see. We genuinely want his ministry to succeed in this significant undertaking. We therefore encourage its U.S. partners to find opportunities to support such curriculum development as well as grassroots programs to promote religious freedom and inclusivity among Egypt's youth. In closing, USERF fully understands that Egypt is a massive, populous, and complicated country, and that change comes very slowly. We appreciate the President's public engagement and the efforts our many friends in government who dialogue with us have made about these important issues. However, the pace of slow change can be no real excuse to avoid the sort of legal and social accountability, protection, and substantial reform that's needed to finally and truly end the serious and long-standing challenges and indeed threats that Coptic Christians have faced for many generations. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your remarks and recommendations, Commissioner. We're honored to have you with us today, and also we're honored to have you on our board now. So this is exciting to work more and more with you.
Honored to be here as well, and I thank you for including me, and also honored to be able to join the Congressman as well as some of my favorite voices on these issues. So thanks again for putting together a terrific event.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Now we'll pivot over to Dr. Werthmuller. I know who works with you at the Commission, who's undertaken a lot of research on Egypt himself, and who has, I know, a series of remarks that really complement much of what you shared. So Dr. Werthmuller, please kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you for that reminder. Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Congressman Hill and Congressman Sherman, really an honor to be appearing alongside of you. And of course, Commissioner Mann's always a pleasure. And Sam, it's always great to see you and to have the pleasure of speaking alongside of you. It's been a while. Lots of things that we can talk about here and discuss. It's of course, as is often invoked when we talk about the Egyptian context, it's complicated. Stephen, please feel free to give me a virtual hands up or throw something at your screen if you find that I'm going on a little bit long. And I probably have some things we can eventually get to in the Q&A as well. But I'd like to talk about a couple of things as Commissioner Manza suggested. First of all, she made some references to the implementation of the church building law, and I want to support what she said, and just note for those of you that like statistics, it's always a dangerous thing when you get someone who's trained as a historian to try to do math, but just to give you a few bits of figures, because there's both progress but also a little bit of a concern in these terms. In 2020, the cabinet committee that's been tasked with approving church registrations, they approved 388 church and church-related buildings to be formally registered last year. But this was a bit of a decline. There had been 785 approved in 2019 and 627 in 2018. So, not only is that a decline, but we're still only looking at about a third of the properties that have applied for registration. And this is from a law that passed in 2016. So, this is a glacial pace, unfortunately, that these are moving at. It's good to see these registrations. And, as our reporting has noted over the last couple of years, we certainly see flaws in the law. Ideally, we would like to see a unified houses of worship framework in Egypt, in which all places of worship fall under the same sort of administrative rules. But it's an incremental progress that we would certainly like to see moving much faster. The other thing as well that I would like to reiterate, as Commissioner Mann's pointed to, is we are grateful to see that the Egyptian government has started to put in place rules that new neighborhoods should have churches as well as mosques available for the community to worship as they see fit, and that of course is from a directive coming directly from President Sisi. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, but it's incomplete. In a sense, this mandate for these buildings, it's a no risk order, because these are empty neighborhoods. These are places where no one lives, and therefore no one, frankly, is going to be angry about it or make a fuss. The real challenge, as we're going to continue to get into today, is in the pre-existing places, communities with hundreds and frankly thousands of years of society. And Egypt presents an interesting example in this regard, where unlike in some other countries in the Middle East, where people of different religious persuasions are separated into different communities, sometimes by entirely different towns or villages, there's no sort of segregation like that in Egypt. Certainly we see that there are places where there are proportionally more Christians, proportionally a larger majority of Muslims, and sometimes other communities as well. But these aren't places where people are living in entirely distinct communities. They're living right alongside each other, sharing apartment buildings, sharing homes right next to each other, cheek by jowl. And sometimes we can say that that's a wonderful thing. That's one of the things that makes Egypt special and fascinating in many ways, that shared life together. But when it goes wrong, it goes wrong. And, we certainly find that in areas like Minya province, where there's a higher proportion of a Christian population, this is where we see the most incidences of sectarian violence, or, let's call it what it is, to be more precise, of anti-Christian violence in those communities. That's not a coincidence that these issues happen in Minya province, because of course we see that they also occur from time to time, albeit with less frequency recently, in Asyut, in Luxor, in Guinea, and in other places as well. So I'll leave the church building issue to the side for now, because of course Commissioner Mann's already made some points about it. What I'd like to turn to is a little bit of some of the overlapping legal challenges and with religious freedom concerns that we have as a commission. First and foremost, one that both members of Congress made reference to, and I'm glad to hear that. And of course, that's some of the detentions and ongoing legal challenges for members of Egyptian civil society, people that are human rights defenders, and very often at the same time, religious freedom advocates. Right now, the individual that we're perhaps most highlighting within the religious freedom community is Rami Kamel, of course, who was detained in November 2019. Not coincidentally, of course, one day before he was set to fly out to Geneva, Switzerland, to speak on minority issues at the United Nations. And he's been not theoretically imprisoned during this time. He's been in what's called pretrial detention, which is renewed on a periodic basis. And even though there's been a little bit of murkiness about the charges, we do know that the charges that are levied against him include, among other things, colluding with a terrorist organization to spread false information. And so we can see here a mix of both a crackdown on civil society, a reference to Egypt's recent cybersecurity law, which talks about dissemination of false information, and of course its anti-terrorism policies. So there's a real mixing and mingling and blending together of these different concerns in Rami's case. During that time now, and what's well over a year, he has spent most of that in solitary confinement, very limited access for visits for his family to come and see him, some access to his legal counsel, although again, it's a little bit murky as to exactly how much access he's had to that. And we've heard over the last couple of months that his health has really been deteriorating because of those prison conditions that he's in. And so we're quite concerned about his case. More recently, of course, many of you followed, as members of Congress also pointed to, was the case of the detention of several staff members of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which is a highly regarded and highly respected NGO in Egypt, and one that USCIRF has looked to over the years for objective and clear analysis with lots of really good documentation on the sorts of things that they say. And once again, not coincidentally, this came just a matter of a couple of weeks after members of the EIPR staff had spoken to a group of dignitaries from the European Union about the state of civil society in Egypt, which of course is a rather concerning state. Now, after a massive public outcry, thankfully, most of those members of EIPR were released from detention. The ones that had been immediately arrested were detained. There was an outcry from, of course, members of Congress in the United States. There were diplomats and dignitaries from Europe, from the US and other places. Even Scarlett Johansson posted a video calling for the release. And Egypt is a place that is deeply concerned about its international image. And clearly in this case, that international outcry made a difference. However, and this is an important principle when we're talking about these issues in Egypt, it's always important to watch the aftermath. What happens after someone is released from detention after pressure? In this case, 3 of the members of the IPR were released. Another member who had been imprisoned earlier in the year, of course, Patrick Zaki, remains in pretrial detention. But these these more recent detentions, they were released, but their assets were seized by a terrorism court in Cairo. The idea that these individuals would have any sort of connection to terrorism by any stretch of the imagination is simply preposterous. But that was the court that seized assets. So, what do these cases say about the state of religious freedom in Egypt? Well, USCIRF has released multiple statements about these cases, most recently just a couple of weeks ago about Rami Kamel's situation, again expressing deep concern for his circumstances. We issued a statement about EIPR as well. And it's important to note, as I mentioned, or to reiterate, that these detentions have all happened in conjunction with civil societies engaging with the international community to shed light on Egypt's civil society challenges. And the message in this is clear that the Egyptian government, as grateful as we are for their engagement and for their changing and shifting the public discourse on religious freedom in the country, we're grateful for that. But it does show that as far as the Egyptian government concerns, only they can talk about these things framed the way that they wanted to. When members of civil society become too public and too specific in their concerns that they're raising and the information that they're sharing, that's when they get into trouble. The reality is, of course, that as concerned as Egypt is about its international image, it's these detentions, these arrests, that make them look bad. It is not the things that these members of Egyptian civil society have to say that make Egypt look bad. And that's an unfortunate irony of these arrests. Another case, of course, that's received appropriately a lot of attention over the course of the last couple of weeks, and to a certain degree over the last couple of years, is the case of Suad Thabit, often known locally in Egypt as Sitt al-Karam, or the Lady of al-Karam, the name of the village that she's from. And I'd like to give a very quick rundown of the events surrounding her case, both the incident that placed her into the public eye, uncomfortably, I think, in her case, but also, again, as I mentioned, the aftermath, because it's been a very complicated set of legal challenges that have surrounded her case. In 2016, in the village of al-Karam in Minya province, where so many of these issues come to light, a rumor had spread that this woman's son, Ashraf, had what was locally referred to as an illicit affair with a Muslim woman, in and of itself a reason for outrage. And a mob of somewhere around the lines of 300 people, incited by a local preacher, and not probably, but as I understand it, the family of the woman who rumors had circulated about, they went out into the streets, attacked a bunch of Coptic-owned homes, burning down 5 of those homes, and they actually went into Mrs. Thabit's house, beat her husband, both elderly, in their late 70s at the time, and removed her from the house, stripped her of her clothing, and then paraded her in the streets to great shame and mocking and jeering her. This was an incident that was widely seen because there were videos of it that circulated online, and there was a massive domestic outcry, of course, of lots of Egyptians that saw this incident as horrible and shameful. Rightfully so, of course. But afterward, a couple of things happened. One is because of the tremendous outcry, President Sisi actually, he rarely comments on these sorts of sectarian incidents, but actually decried it publicly, to his credit. However, the case against the 3 men who had directly attacked Mrs. Thabit, their case was dropped in 2017 and eventually, under some ambiguous circumstances, eventually reopened. 24 men were initially convicted of attacks in early 2020. But I'm going to come back around to their case in just a minute, because earlier earlier this year, 2020 and 21 are still causing us problems. In early 2020, there was one of these reconciliation councils that we've spent a lot of time talking about over the years, and Commissioner Manza has already made reference to, was convened 4 years after the incident. And during the course of this so-called reconciliation council, local Copts were basically forced to recant their statements from several years earlier, and I'm going to use scare quotes here, reconcile with those 24 men who had been convicted of arson and committing sectarian violence. Now, they had technically been found guilty in the subsequent trial, but it's very likely that we're going to see some overturning in the appeals process of those cases. They happen to be in the appeals process right now. To make matters worse, Mrs. Suad, the only member of this community of people that had been involved with this, she and her family refused to reconcile. And that's important because her case has continued to move forward. And yet, even though those her three attackers were found guilty initially, an appeals court just a couple of weeks ago overturned that conviction to, as you can imagine, the horror of the Coptic community that once again, as our members of Congress used this word very crucially earlier, the impunity that placed on this sort of violence, the impunity for the attackers. Now, it is important to note that the public prosecutor has announced that he is going to revisit this overturning of their conviction. Let's hope that results in a new conviction. But right now, it's a very troubling set of circumstances. So a couple of things to note. Thank you for the reminder on time. I could go on for about an hour on some of these issues, so apologies for this. But I want to note a couple of things about this, because this sort of case shows us some important dynamics that are so concerning for the Coptic Christian community. First of all, of course, is the inciting incident in the first place, this mob attack on local Copts that came out of a rumor, and most of these attacks come out of rumors, hundreds of people in the street attacking and destroying Coptic homes and properties, sometimes lives. And that in and of itself, this terror that strikes in the community is terrible. Even though we've seen a decline in the sheer number of those attacks in the last 2 years, they still occur. They've occurred just in the last year, and they're deeply troubling. But then, of course, to add insult to injury is the miscarriage of justice, especially as these so-called reconciliation committees are convened. Because as Commissioner Manza noted earlier, universally, they end with absolving the attackers of responsibility. And at the same time, they very often, not in every single case, but they very often require blame to be shared on the part of the victims. And sometimes it requires the individuals or families to leave their home villages altogether. We've seen a number of those incidences over the year. It's important to note, and I promise this is one of my last comments that I'll make here. It's important to note that one of the worst incidences of violence against the Coptic community, Sam and I were working together at this time back in 2011, known as the Maspero massacre, when the military attacked Coptic protesters in Cairo. They weren't gathered just to generally protest the state of politics in Egypt. They had gathered to protest the burning of a church by a sectarian mob down in Luxor just a little bit earlier that year. That's why everyone had gathered in Maspero to say, no more of this. And how sad it is that fast forwarding, 10 years at this point, those incidences, those mob attacks and the false reconciliation committees that follow them are still occurring. And so we as USERF, continue to look to these as representative of some of the serious challenges that, as much as we are grateful for some of the progress in discourse and education and things that Egypt has been apparently making, these are very deep-seated issues that are just not yet being addressed. So Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you for indulging my long-windedness.
It was not long-winded at all, Dr. Werthmulder. We really appreciate the data and the work that you do, and it adds a great deal to our panel. It's very important that we have thought leaders and elected officials, but it's also important that we have research and data and someone who knows the country. So we're very grateful for your work and for your time. I wanted to pivot over now to Samuel Tedros, who's also, I will mention another board member of In Defense of Christians. We're honored to have him with us. And I wanted to turn to Sam just because, Sam, you're like the leading Coptic sort of scholar that we have in DC. And I wanted to turn to you for some assessments. And in particular, I'd love to see your assessment of how Egypt did, or essentially of Egypt's treatment of its Coptic Christian population in 2020. I'd like to see your thoughts on congressional engagement from the last session of Congress, what you think this upcoming Congress can do, as well as your reflections on the previous administration, the Trump administration, as well as the incoming administration. So looking very much forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with the congressmen who have been leading voices on defending Christians in Egypt, as well as the region as a whole, as well as joining my esteemed colleagues and friends who've been tireless advocates on that issue for many years now, and whose voices in the public square have really contributed in elevating the topic and the discussion about Copts in Egypt. You asked me to give a grade for the President Sisi's performance, and of course, anyone who teaches hates nothing more than giving grades. It also depends, of course, on whether we're grading on a curve or not, whether it's in comparison to previous performances by Egypt's president, or just how Sisi has behaved. But before I provide a grade and an assessment of the Sisi administration, of Congress's work, and of the Trump administration, I think we need to define what the metrics are. What are we grading him on? And of course, the Egyptian regime is not the only actor when it comes to discrimination in Egypt or the persecution of Copts. There are Islamist actors, there's the broader society and its action. But the role that the government plays, I think, is in 5 key areas. The first, as the commissioner mentioned, is that of the church building law. The church building law came, or was long awaited, for many years by the Copts. The Mubarak regime had promised it, the Morsi regime, even the military when it ruled before Morsi, and finally Sisi. When the law came out, I think it was a disappointment to many people, and we've seen the results of that today. The positive side of the law was this promise to legalize the situation of pre-existing churches that were there in the country that did not have any legal framework, although they were functioning and operating. On that regard, as was mentioned, only 1,800 applications have been approved, about 1,050 something of churches, and the rest of church-associated buildings. With this pace, we're looking at a 10-year, even more, until they finally legalize these churches. The negative aspect of the law was that it made the building of new churches in Egypt much harder. Kurt has spoken about the approval of new churches, or the building of new churches in those new communities in the desert. And of course, the government, as he pointed out, has welcomed doing this. But under President Sisi, in all these years, there's been one single church that has been approved in one of Egypt's existing villages. And that's the church that was built for the martyrs of Libya. And it gives us an example of the problem here, because here you have ISIS killing Copts in Libya. You have the president of Egypt promising to build a church to honor those martyrs in that village where they came from, Al-Ur. And then the reaction of the mob refusing to allow the church to be built inside their village, attacking the homes of the very families that lost their loved ones at the hands of ISIS in Libya, and then a reconciliation session that, instead of forces those people to accept that Christians can have a church in their village, agrees to their demand of moving the church, which is a magnificent building that has been built now, but moving it to the outskirts of the village, that it wouldn't be in their midst. So on the issue of church building, I think President Sisi would get a C at best for his performance on that regard. The second issue is that of appointments. We've seen, as the commissioner mentioned, a lot of very important steps that have been taken in terms of appointing 2 governors Christian governors. This is not the first time Mubarak appointed one, but it's still a welcome step that was taken, as well as even at lesser levels in terms of local government. We've had a few Christians appointed in positions of deputy governor, of mayors, of overlooking local areas. So I think there has been some significant improvement in that regard. Obviously, the percentage of Christians has increased in parliament due to the law requiring a quota for Christians as well as other groups, women and Egyptians abroad and others in parliament. But on other levels of appointments, we haven't seen any movement. There are still sectors of the Egyptian state that are completely closed to Copts. The percentage of Copts in the intelligence service is 0%. There isn't a single one allowed. The percentage of Copts in the state security, Amn Watani or Amn Dawla, is again 0%. They're not trusted, and that sends a message. The percentage of Copts in the foreign service, ranks of ambassadors and others, in terms of the judiciary, in terms of government companies, which continue to be a major sector of the Egyptian economy. All of these are very low numbers that do not reflect the reality of Coptic representation in Egypt. So the positive steps there would probably get him a B, although there's still a lot of things to be done there. Similarly, education, the educational system has been one often that excludes Copts in terms of teaching their history. Egyptian history is, of course, a simple line. The pharaohs, Alexander the Great comes, the Romans, and then there's this gap in history where absolutely nothing basically happened until the Arabs and Muslims came. And even under the Arab-Muslim rule, Copts continued to constitute the majority for a number of centuries. And again, anything about them is not there. So the question of the Coptic representation in the educational system, not just writing a few messages about national unity and toleration, but the reality of explaining to Egyptian kids the contributions of Copts to Egyptian history throughout Egypt's history is still lacking. We've seen some improvement there. It was mentioned the Minister of Education has taken important steps in terms of toleration in those educational material and others, but still the coverage of the Coptic history of Egypt is lacking. And that, of course, allows people to form all kinds of imaginary things about the people that share with them the same country. Kurt mentioned an attack on a church that led to the Maspero massacre in 2011. A couple of months earlier, there was an attack on another church in Giza, and the accusation toward the Copts there was that they were engaged in magic. They were doing black magic against Muslims, and for proof, they pointed out to texts that, surprise, surprise, was written in Coptic. So this lack of knowledge about the very contribution, any basic stuff about Copts is extremely problematic, although the steps in terms of reforming the educational system are, of course, welcome. Then we have the fourth area is that of the legal framework. We've had some improvement in terms of courts ruling in favor of Coptic women in receiving equal inheritance and not having Islamic Sharia applied to them, although we are still not sure about how universal those verdicts are going to be applied, whether they are limited to the case that was in front of the court, but the regime has taken no step in that regard. The regime has also not taken any serious step in terms of an anti-discrimination law that actually is applied on the ground, or in terms of dealing with the blasphemy law that is unequally applied to religious minorities. And it's the Copts, the Shia, the Quranists, and these Baha'is, these groups that suffer 99% of those cases revolving the blasphemy law. The last area, and probably the most important area, is how the government deals with sectarian attacks. And in that regard, I think Sisi receives a very clear F, a complete failure by the government. For the past 50 years, we have had the same thing happening over and over again, with the government somehow expecting that the results will change, although every time does the same steps. Again, we have an attack that the police refuses to intervene to stop, although most of the times they are informed beforehand about the attack taking place. We have then the arrest of an equal number of Christians and Muslims to force a reconciliation session. We have a reconciliation session that gives the mob most of its demands, whether they want to kick people out of the village, whether they want the church to be outside of the village, whether they want a church that doesn't have a dome or a tower or a bell, all of these demands that they put. And the end result is not a single person in the past 50 years in over 1,000 attacks, sectarian mob attacks from 1970 until today, not a single person has been convicted, has spent time in jail for attacking Christians. The government is all happy to pass verdicts, all kinds of verdicts, death sentences on ISIS terrorists, on Muslim Brotherhood members who attack the churches, because these are the enemies of the government anyway. But when it comes to the mob attacks, we've had a complete failure by the government, creating not a culture of impunity, but a culture of encouragement. You can go out, attack the Copts, and your demands are going to be met by the government, and you're not going to get any punishment for it. Why not do it? It's really encouraging people by this government behavior to continue in the same path. Of course, President Sisi has, as a person, been perhaps the most outreaching towards the Copts in Egypt. He's been someone that I think has not shown any sign of intolerance towards them. He's always spoken positively about the Copts, and I think he really appreciates the Copts, the Coptic Pope, especially the fact that the Copts did not look for any foreign help after those significant attacks on the churches in Egypt at the hands of Muslim Brotherhood supporters in 2013. In his eyes, in a sense, the Copts proved their patriotism by not looking for any outside help. And he has, of course, taken also some symbolic steps in terms of going to church, of course, only on Christmas, never on Easter. Islam recognizes Christ's birth, but not his crucifixion or resurrection. But these are important things, and it matters when the president speaks in positive terms about the Copts in Egypt, in sending a message throughout the bureaucracy, the Egyptian state, that yes, these are equal Egyptians, as he always speaks about them. So the overall record is mixed. There are some areas that have had improvement. Personally, his rhetoric has been very positive, but are also significant areas where the problem has persisted and the situation has continued to worsen on the ground. When it comes to the Trump administration, I think it's also a mixed record. We've had religious freedom become a key component of the administration's foreign policy, of speaking about it internationally. But when it came convening the ministerial, other steps a lot that have really put religious freedom there at the center of the agenda. However, when it came to Egypt, I think we've had an attitude of accepting the Egyptian regime's policies towards Copts as the best that can be. They're not as bad as Mubarak, and they're certainly much better than the alternatives of the Muslim Brotherhood or other groups. So in that regard, the Egyptian regime has received a kind of green light or a kind of approval to continue with its policies, and with praise from the administration coming for such steps as the symbolic building of the biggest cathedral in the Middle East, or whatever they call it. It actually isn't, but all of these steps that have resulted in tweets and visits. Secretary Pompeo went there. I think actually that church symbolizes a lot of the problem in Egypt. It's built in the desert, but you still can't pray inside the cities. It's built for no one. And it's named by the Egyptian president. I mean, there isn't a single Coptic church in the world that is named the Birth of Christ Church. The president chose that name. We as Copts, we name our churches after our saints. We don't name them of nativity or anything like that. So it's a telling thing that even the name of that cathedral was chosen by the Egyptian president. Trump has also, I think, should be praised in some of the outreach or things he's done with the Coptic American community, the presidential letters on the Global Coptic Day. These things were symbolic and made Copts, especially in the United States, feel that their contribution to the United States has been appreciated and that they're part of the American political landscape. Congress, of course, has been much better than the administration, in my view, in terms of dealing with the Coptic issue. Resolution 49, I think, has been probably the most significant piece of legislation that has been done on the Copts for a very long time. And it's not just that the resolution is there, that there are things written in it. The specific areas that it has called for action on, I think, are important to highlight. It mentioned education and the need for educational reform. It talked about equality and how Copts should be granted legal equality in the country. And it also talked about this culture of impunity, this need to deal with the reconciliation sessions. So it was, I think, a positive thing that the resolution was there, the language that it had, the number of sponsors that it has received. Unfortunately, the resolution was obviously not passed during the last Congress's session. Hopefully, I'm happy to hear that the resolution will be reintroduced, and hopefully some action can be taken in that regard. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but to end with the Biden administration, I think there's a risk that many advocates of religious freedom fear that the new administration will sideline religious freedom, that due to the centrality of the topic under the Pompeo State Department, the issue will be sidelined and ignored. And I think that would be a really bad thing, not just because it affects real people on the ground and their lives, but because religious freedom shouldn't be a partisan issue. There's nothing about it that should be just a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. On the other hand, I think we're going to see more pressure on Egypt regarding human rights in general. President-elect Biden has already, even as a candidate, tweeted about some of these cases before. He's talked about it. I think there'll be some interest in pressuring Egypt on human rights issues, and hopefully religious freedom wouldn't be completely ignored under that package, and some steps would be taken, especially, again, on that issue where we continue to see no action by the Egyptian regime. And that's the reality of the attacks and the lack of punishment, creating this culture of impunity and of encouragement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's always an honor to have your testimony, and we couldn't be more excited to have you and Congressman Hill on the call, building momentum for that resolution when it does get introduced. So we're very grateful for you and for your leadership. At this point, I'm actually going to turn to one of our awesome interns for the winter, Sophia, who's going to help us facilitate questions and answers for about the next 20 minutes. So, Sophia, would you care to share the first question that caught your attention?
Of course. Thank you, Stephen. Our first question is from Irini, who asks, is there a way to reduce funding to Egypt until basic human rights are actually instituted?
Absolutely. Let's turn to Sam for that one.
As an Egyptian, I wouldn't want Egypt to get less assistance. I think Egypt is a country that suffers from a lot of problems, and U.S. assistance plays an important role, not just the military assistance, but various programs that have been conducted throughout the years that have helped the Egyptian people. Whether it's on food issues, whether it's on the water, sewage, and other programs that have been there. But I think that there is a need to look at how to channel that aid to the more needy situations and to put some metrics on it. I think, for example, any non-military assistance going to Egypt should be localized. Minya is a governorate that has been mentioned, I don't know, a lot of times in this conversation, and it's very obvious that whether it's the security chiefs there or the governor, the various governors that have passed throughout the years have completely failed to do anything. I think there should be some punishment for this and some carrot maybe for other governorates that perform better on these issues, religious freedom, on human rights violation, on others like this. So if the regime claims that the central authority or the capital sends the right message and the problem is with the local authorities should feel the brunt of, yes, you're doing really bad on religious freedom issues. Maybe Minya shouldn't get the new hospital, maybe Suhag should, or things like that.
Thank you very much.
Just real quickly say that USCIRF does have a recommendation to require the State Department to provide explicit justification for the release to Egypt of any previously withheld foreign military financing, including public disclosure of its assessment and certification of Egypt's progress towards improving human rights and religious freedom conditions. So we didn't withhold, we just asked that the government explain giving additional military funds to bring up the religious freedom and human rights.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you as well, Sam. Sophia, would you care to share the next question?
Of course. So our second question is from Jason, who asks, do the panelists consider the Copts to be persecuted? What is gained or risked by using this word?
Let's start with Dr. Worthmuller. Would you care to chime in on that?
Absolutely. Threw me the easy one here. So yeah, persecution, of course, is a tough word. I just noted that in some of the there had been just a reporting over the last week of the question of whether His Holiness Pope Tewodros, rejected and has long rejected the use of that term to reference the Coptic situation. And look, the word persecution, because it comes with a lot of baggage, it is one that is complicated in the Egyptian context. As we've said a number of times, it's complicated. But yes, I think it is appropriate. Egypt is not a circumstance like it's not the worst of the worst, and it's not the best of the best. And this is why it's important for us as a commission. We always look at countries in and of themselves. What are the religious freedom conditions in that country, not comparing to what it looks like, for example, with Egypt, not comparing it to Iran, not comparing it to Sudan, not comparing it to Iraq, right? And I think that's important. And look, as all of us on the panel and members of Congress have pointed out rightly, there have been some areas of change, of positive change. The discourse has changed. There have been some administrative adjustments in the country. And, as someone who's been working in and on Egypt for the last, a little over a quarter century, sometimes on contemporary things, sometimes with my head in the 13th century, I had seen a shift in the way that these things are publicly talked about in Egypt. And that is a good thing, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, for regular people, and I think that's important sometimes to kind of step away from the mile-high view of policy and think about the impact of conditions on real living, breathing people. And the change of discourse, the opening of the cathedral, registration of churches, and that last one might be an exception in some cases. Those things sound good, but for a villager who's in a little village outside of Melawi or down in Luxor or something like that, where they're facing daily discrimination or harassment, or in some cases riots from their neighbors, not people coming from outside of the country, but people that they've known their entire lives, committing violence, I don't think they would have a problem using that word persecution. I actually, and I promise I'll be very concise here, but I just want to read you a quote that I stumbled across. Over the last couple of weeks, of course, I've been following the Suad Thabit case closely. And back in 2016, when this incident first occurred, Reuters did a nice summary of this. And they talked to a man from the village. And here's what he told the reporter. If it were just a burning, as in, the burning of these several Coptic-owned houses, if it were just a burning, we could handle it. But what can we do about what happened to the woman? How can you compensate for this insult? Now, agreed. The shame that this poor elderly woman was put through properly caused a lot of outrage, and that was terrible. But listen to that first part of his sentence. If it were just a burning, if they had just come and burnt our houses down, we could handle it. no community should ever have to say that. No community should have to accept that as just, yeah, that's the way it is. That's part of life. And, sadly, when we hear sometimes from Egyptian officials, sometimes members of Orthodox and Protestant leadership in the country, sometimes when we hear from the Egyptian government, they say, look, that's Upper Egypt. It's different. That's the way the, Saidis deal with things. Change comes very, very slowly. Well, no person should ever have to accept the burning of their homes and mob attacks as just, it is what it is. And so because of that sort of a situation, I think that particularly in circumstances in Egypt, I think persecution is an applicable word to some of those circumstances.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Worthmuller. Commissioner Sam, would either of you care to weigh in on that question?
I would defer to Sam with his personal experience, and me having just read about persecution of Copts over the last couple hundred years. I feel less qualified to speak with you sitting right there. I could quote you though, if you'd like.
I think I agree with Kurt, absolutely. Yes, Copts privately, not the church leadership, and we always need to be careful about what the leadership says, because they're not free to speak their minds completely. It's not like the Pope can come out and be against the government and things will be normal in Egypt. There is a price to be paid when you take or any step against the Egyptian government. And the previous Pope paid that price very clearly when he was imprisoned by Sadat in the monastery from 1981, and Mubarak released him then 3 or 4 years after. So I think it's very clear that when you talk to the Copts, how they feel about the reality of their lives in Egypt. And I want to pick on that incident that Kurt mentioned, because there are a lot of details there that give you the full picture of the persecution. So I said that the elderly woman received the attention. She was not the only woman that her clothes were taken off of her and paraded naked that day. Her son, the other son, not the one accused of having the affair, but the other son's wife was also paraded naked in the street that day. This has never been, as far as I know, reported in the English language at least, but that happened that day, and the family could not talk about it because with an elderly woman, there's, in their eyes, at least in that culture, less affluent to their honor than a younger woman being paraded naked in the street. So I went to the police station to file a report about the incident, and the police refused to file a report. That's government action. That's not something that happens there. It's only after there was public pressure, when the bishop intervened in that case, that the police finally filed that report. The issue then went to Egypt's district attorney, or whatever we call him, the equivalent in the US, and they again did not move the case. It's only when the head of the lawyers syndicate went and pressured the attorney's office, the Egyptian government attorney's office, that they finally brought the case. And then again, with all the things that Kurt mentioned in his talk about the problems there. So in all of these, I think there is government action. And that, I think, more than anything else, signifies that yes, it is persecution. It's not just some discriminatory policies or things happen in society. There is direct government action or lack of action that creates the Coptic predicament in Egypt.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I'll turn to Sophia now for our last question for the discussion.
All right, our final question is, how should neighboring countries and the international community respond to the persecution of Copts to effectively stop it?
I'd love to hear from each of our panelists just briefly on this one. So I'll turn to Commissioner Manza first.
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, every country has a different level, a different kind of relationship with Egypt, and they should use the relationships that they have to bring these issues up. So first of all, they privately, and most of the time, is more effective in a country like Egypt, probably with a government to government conversation. So unfortunately, we don't always get to know that happened. But I would just urge other governments in other countries like the EU and the UK, and really any government that interacts with Egypt, to bring up the issues of religious freedom, of prisoners of conscience, to the issues we've talked about. The recommendations you have made are really solid, that other governments should be urging. And of course, to provide support when appropriate to the Coptic community in a way that doesn't hurt them. I think it's super important, as we've seen that, we saw this in Iraq, as for instance, building beautiful things for the Christians, and other, others not seeing the same sort of support. So I think wise support of the Coptic community as well, and following the lead of the Coptic community and giving them support. I think it's super important that people that are the Coptic community themselves are the ones making the recommendations on how to kind of the support they need, and that governments are supporting them that way. And instead of just making bilateral decisions on how to give support, or how to even verbally support this community without making sure that the support is actually going to be helpful.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Well, very much well said. Dr. Werthmuller, any thoughts on this?
Sure. I would agree everything Commissioner Manza just said. Egypt is a country that cares about how it looks. It's always been concerned about that, and continues to be concerned. And so, it's important that and at the same time, Egypt is a country that does engage. They do talk to partners, and they do talk to other countries, and in some contexts more so than others, they speak openly about some of these issues. And so it's important to just keep raising them. I'm so appreciative of members of Congress and members of various U.S. administrations that bring these things to the Egyptian government. And I hope the Biden administration, as Sam, you mentioned, there is evidence that they will be bringing up human rights, and along with that, we hope religious freedom issues for Egypt. But I'd also say, in terms of the question was referring to neighbors, I never in a million years thought I would say these words. Egypt should look to the example of Sudan, just to the south. And the reason I say that is for one very specific word: systematic. Because what we have seen happen, and of course Sudan has, it's a country with a lot of challenges. They have a long way to go. They're in the midst of an interim government, and all sorts of things. Fair enough. But last year, I was lucky enough to be part of a USURF trip to Khartoum. We went and met with members of different religious communities. We met with members of the interim government, including Prime Minister Hamdok. And we heard a number of promises during the course of those meetings. Now, working in these sorts of circles, you get very used to hearing promises, and you just say, maybe something will happen, probably not. Well, and I'll be quite frank here, to my surprise, what we saw was, over the course of last year, the interim government in Sudan actually made changes. They repealed the country's blasphemy law. They put in place protections for women. They removed a lot of the barriers for Christians, for indigenous religions. In other words, they've actually made systematic changes to the way that the country treats religious minorities, and just broader questions of religious freedom and gender rights and all sorts of things like that. Systematic changes make a real difference in real people's lives, and they look really good. And for a country that is concerned with how it appears and wants to be more stable and more secure and more prosperous, those sorts of systematic changes would really, really make a big difference for Egypt if they're serious about moving forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Werthmuller. We really appreciate it. Sam, your thoughts?
Unfortunately, of course, Egypt's neighbors don't put religious freedom or human rights conditions in Egypt on the agenda of their bilateral relationship with Egypt. So that's not, I think, part of any conversation that a Saudi official or an Israeli official or any of Egypt's regional partners would have with the Egyptian regime. One positive development, I would say, was the UAE, which does not talk about these issues, but took, I think, what was a very important step in providing direct funding for Coptic charity and developmental work inside Egypt. So the UAE gave a lot of money for Egyptian society and helping various charities and development projects, and they made sure that at least part of that money went to Coptic charities and Coptic hospitals, other kind of development work. So I thought that was a nice gesture to include the Copts and to show that this is not a religious issue or anything, that we support all Egyptians, whether Muslims or Christians.
Thank you very much, Sam. No, we are very grateful for your thoughts. And again, we want to thank all of our panelists, for participating in the Q&A, for your opening remarks. I think that we have a lot of momentum here, and hopefully Congressman Hill, Congressman Sherman, and their staffs on the call have some good ideas for how to update the resolution for this upcoming Congress. At this point, we're going to transition into the concluding part of our program, where I'll have each of our panelists deliver closing remarks, and then I'll give the last say to IDC's president, Tawfiq Baklini. But to begin with, for closing remarks, I wanted to invite Commissioner Manza to share any concluding thoughts with us.
Sure, great. I just wanted to join with my colleague, Dr. Kurt Worthmuller, and urge the government of Egypt to release Rami Kamel, especially following news of his declining health and the risk of developing COVID-19. I feel like this particularly gives the government an opportunity to show goodwill to the Coptic community, which would be well received. And, I also wanted just to say that, as you can tell from my remarks and those of my fellow panelists, we all have great affection for the country of Egypt. The recommendations that USCIRF has made are solid, and as Dr. Worthmuller had mentioned, would result in increased tolerance and religious freedom in Egypt, which would lead to improved security that would only help economic growth. So these are really a win-win for the country of Egypt. And so I just do hope that the president continues to say the things he's saying. He continues to look at these kind of recommendations, that the government continues to dialogue with us, which we appreciate, and that we only see positive growth in the right direction for the country of Egypt. And thanks again to In Defense of Christians for this really interesting conversation. I so appreciate your willingness to bring together people to be able to have these important discussions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We're always grateful for your leadership and support for this work. Dr. Worthmuller, would you care to share your concluding thoughts?
Absolutely. Sam said something really interesting a little bit earlier when he was talking about the circumstances in some of the villages, and which is the fact that for many people who are on unfortunately receiving the blunt end of the reconciliation councils that we've all referred to a number of times, that for many people they look at those circumstances as just, this is the best we're going to get. What do you want from us? And unfortunately, when we look at some of these circumstances in Egypt, despite the areas of modest progress that we as a commission are always keen to point out and should be recognized and acknowledged, at the same time, when we look at some of these thorny or trickier issues, things like reconciliation councils, like societal discrimination, like the exclusion from non-Muslims from sectors of the government, as Sam pointed out, like security and intel, all portfolios that specifically deal with Copts, of course, in and of itself is a problem. But so often that's a very similar refrain. As we know, of course, the Coptic Orthodox Church itself officially is okay with reconciliation councils, and the sense that we've always had over the years is that very sentiment. It's the best we're going to get. At least people are allowed to exist and to continue to be in the villages. That's the best we're going to get. We have no hope for the police helping. We have no hope for the security sectors to intervene. That's a very unfortunate state of affairs. And if we really actually want to see genuine progress in Egypt, and those who really in good faith want to improve the country and move forward, that sentiment can never be tolerated, that this is the best we're going to get. The reality is that Egypt is a country with tremendous potential. Its people are amazing. It has resources. It has many, many wonderful things. And as Commissioner Manza mentioned, it's a place very dear to my heart. But at the same time, we shouldn't just take, this is the best we're going to get as enough. These sorts of systematic changes that actually deal with these real issues, not just simple no-risk fixes, but actually address these root issues in places that are the most challenging to deal with them, in many province, but elsewhere in Upper Egypt and in the Nile Delta where these issues emerge. That's where the real work is, and I hope to see real work taking place. So, no one can have to say we can live with burning houses, or no one will have to say this is the best we're going to get. We don't need that minimalization.
Absolutely, Dr. Worthmuller. And it's well said that, we all love Egypt and we want what's best for the Egyptian people, and that is a free country. So it's very well said. I'd like to invite Sam to share his concluding thoughts.
Well, let me pick up where Kurt stopped, and I think that's the kind of conversation that we need to be having with Egypt, and that Egypt needs to have with itself. The reality is that the Copts will survive. They will survive, maybe not inside of Egypt, they might survive elsewhere. There are already over 1 million Copts living outside of Egypt, and they flourished in these new countries. But it's the loss for Egypt that should trouble the Egyptian regime the most. What the Egyptian regime is losing is Rami Malek, is losing an Oscar-winning actor, it's losing Dina Powell, it's losing these kinds of people that could have contributed to Egypt, that could have made Egypt much better. Egypt has so many challenges and it needs all of its children. And the Copts are certainly its children to contribute to its advancement. If the Egyptian regime, as Kurt points out, has really dealt with the Coptic issue as a security problem that needs to be dealt with by the security services, the reality is it's a national security crisis for Egypt. The fact that it's losing so many of its best children and that who will never return once again, and the loss of their contributions to its development and advancement.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And again, for those looking to learn more on this, we're just going to continue to plug that book, Motherland Lost. It's the best resource that many of us have found on Coptic issues in Egypt. And they're an amazing people. And if you're interested, obviously, in the history of Christianity, it's a very important place to start. So with that being said, I'll invite IDC's president, Tawfiq Baklini, to deliver the final concluding remark.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to our expert panelists, as usual. As we've always been and always will be, we will always be the voice of the voiceless. As you've already mentioned, the Coptic Pope might not be able to say or speak freely. We will be the voice of the Copts in Egypt. We will be the voice of the voiceless Christians. The patriarchs in Iraq and Syria, they have the same problem. We will continue to be the voice of the voiceless. We will work with the Biden administration, and if it's not a priority for them in religious freedom and human rights, that means we're not doing our job. We will work with the Biden administration. We will make sure it is a priority for the Biden administration. And I want to also need your help in making sure we are advocating for the Christian rights in the Middle East, everywhere globally. So thank you for your support. I want to thank the members of Congress as well. It's a nonpartisan issue. We will continue to work, and we will continue the fight for equality and human rights for our people.
Very well said, Tawfiq. And again, just as the panel discussion started, we had Congressman Sherman, Congressman Hill, one Democrat, one Republican, and I think that really says it all. That Americans want to see in Egypt where Christians are respected. With that being said, I want to thank especially our wonderful interns, Sophia and Connor, for their help behind the scenes. I want to thank all of our panelists for your remarks. I think that moving into a new session of Congress, you all help really lay a very strong foundation for a new resolution on Egypt. and have provided very strong recommendations for the incoming administration. So we're very grateful to all of you for your partnership, for your leadership. We look forward to working with you all throughout 2021. And then for those watching the call, and just for general knowledge, we will put this entire panel discussion up on YouTube later today, and we will be sharing it on Facebook and on Twitter so that you can share and reshare with your networks, communities, supporters, and friends. So we're incredibly grateful to all of you. And again, and lastly, but not least, for all those attendees who are watching and asking questions, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for making the discussion engaging. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without your